When did I realize my parent was a sociopath? About 36 hours after the head-on crash that left my wife paralyzed from the neck down. My mother, I will call her Reagan because I don't see her as my mother anymore, walked into our hospital room and started pushing me to divorce my wife. "I'm only looking out for you," Reagan said, firing off loaded questions about medical debt and whether I actually thought my wife could get better. As a physical therapist, I knew the answer was yes. Reagan was a retired nurse who still treated me like a child, so every hopeful thing I said she dismissed as emotional delusion. I remember April's eyes literally following my voice around the room. I pointed that out to Reagan. She somehow used it as ammunition. "That's just basic reflexes," she scoffed. "Anyone with a working brain should know she's got no chance." The jab about April's damaged brain made her cry. The second I saw tears, I physically pushed Reagan out of the room. Unfortunately, she was back less than 12 hours later, and she didn't come alone. She brought her old nursing supervisor and even a divorce attorney. They tried to sit at my wife's bedside while I was literally moving April's arms, trying to get blood into them. April was crying, her heart rate climbing to stroke levels, all because Reagan and her band of idiots stood there explaining how divorce would be a win-win. Reagan actually walked over and started talking over me, borderline screaming at April that she would be a vegetable forever. "The most loving thing you could do right now," Reagan said, "is free your husband from the burden of taking care of you. He probably doesn't even want to do it." My jaw dropped, but I knew getting angry would only stress April out more, so I called a nurse who escorted them out. I went straight to hospital administration and laid everything out. Their answers stunned me. Reagan was an experienced nurse who had worked in this very hospital. Given the circumstances, she was probably correct, just a loving mother looking out for her son. Long story short, they said they'd keep letting her in the room. That night I sat holding April's hand, reciting our vows and our best memories. When I felt it, her finger twitched. It was the happiest moment of my life. I literally ran out of the room screaming with joy. When I came back, I hugged her as gently as I could so I wouldn't hurt her. The happiness didn't last. Reagan's next move was before the sun rose. She was in the room at 5 a.m. with her financial advisor and spreadsheets. I tried to tell her April had moved, but she just pointed at the numbers. "You'll drain your savings supporting her," she said. "Yeah, she was once your wife, but that woman is gone. Look at her. In 5 years, she'll still be a vegetable and you'll be homeless. Is that what you want?" She gave me an ultimatum right then. 48 hours, she said, holding up 2 fingers in front of April's face before I slapped her hand away. "You have 2 days to agree to the divorce, or I'll petition for guardianship." Then, leaning in, she whispered, "And if I'm her guardian, I'll just pull the plug. No divorce needed." I clenched my fists, seconds away from losing it. Later that evening, I was in the room with April, holding her hand and deep diving on hospital laws and cases like ours. My head was spinning and I was borderline crying, trying to stay strong for her. Then it happened. My beautiful wife, when I needed her most, pressed her thumb into my palm, not a mere twitch, but deliberate. 1 press, pause, for quick presses, pause, then 3 more. We'd used that number code on our honeymoon to spell "I love you." My heart nearly exploded. I started crying and kissing her hands and face. Despite it being 3 a.m., I felt more energized and alive than ever. I didn't sleep. I called my lawyer and explained this was concrete evidence. April was getting better. Reagan couldn't use her nonsense anymore. What made me even more confident was what happened the next morning. While doing passive range of motion exercises on April's hand, I felt her push back. This wasn't normal muscle tension. It was deliberate resistance she was controlling. My darling April knew we were getting closer to victory, and it seemed to give her strength. I moved her thumb toward her palm again, and she pushed back. We could now demonstrate voluntary control over her muscles. Everything felt like it was coming together. Then Reagan walked in an hour later. She'd heard about the muscle control and, in response, brought in her neurologist friend. He spent 5 minutes checking April, barely touching her hand. "This is just a reflexive response to stimuli," he declared. "It's involuntary." Your wife is gone, son. That was the moment I snapped. I yelled that they were insane and turned on Reagan. What is wrong with you? What kind of mother does this to her son? I demanded. Instead of answering, she looked at the neurologist. He pulled out his prescription pad and wrote something down. The husband is exhibiting signs of psychosis, he said. We recommend psychiatric evaluation and immediate removal from the wife's medical decisions. He signed it and handed it to Reagan. She nodded, thanked him, and turned to me. You have 24 hours left to decide. I watched Reagan walk out. The second the door closed, I pulled my chair right up against April's bed rail and didn't leave her side. I wasn't leaving this room for anything. My hand found April's, and I squeezed gently, feeling the warmth of her skin against my palm. The clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m. I knew I wouldn't sleep. I couldn't. Reagan's threat kept replaying in my head like a broken record, but I forced myself to focus on April's breathing, the soft rise and fall of her chest, the steady beep of the monitors, the faint pressure of her thumb pressing back into my hand. Around 2 a.m. I felt it again. One press. Pause. For quick presses. Pause. 3 more. I love you. I squeezed back and whispered that I loved her too. That we were going to fight this together. At 6:03 a.m., my phone buzzed, and I grabbed it before the second ring. My lawyer sounded tired but alert. I explained everything in detail while April's thumb kept pressing reassuringly against my palm every few minutes. He told me to document everything, get witnesses, file formal complaints, and said he'd start working on legal options right away. I thanked him and hung up, then looked down at April's hand still resting in mine. That's when it hit me. I needed to start keeping better records. I found a notebook in my bag, flipped it open to the first page, and wrote the date and time at the top. Then I started logging everything, every movement April made, every thumb press, every finger twitch, all with timestamps down to the minute. I recorded her heart rate, her blood pressure, her oxygen levels, everything. The night nurse came in around 6:30 a.m. to check vitals. I showed her what I was doing. She glanced through my notes and nodded slowly. Then she did something I didn't expect. She pulled up April's electronic chart on the computer and began typing, adding her own observations about the coded thumb presses she'd witnessed during her shift. She didn't say much, just gave me a small, reassuring nod before leaving. For the first time in days, I felt like someone finally believed me. At 6:58 a.m., I heard voices in the hallway, and my stomach dropped. Reagan was back, and she wasn't alone. I grabbed my phone, opened the voice recorder app, hit record, and placed it face down on the table beside April's bed. Then I pulled up the patient advocate's number I'd found online and kept it ready to dial. Reagan walked in at exactly 7 a.m. with a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as her financial advisor and immediately began spreading spreadsheets across the foot of April's bed. Reagan launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech about medical bankruptcy, lifetime care costs, and how I'd lose our house within 2 years. The advisor pointed at his spreadsheets, talking about compound interest on medical debt and asset liquidation. I let them go on for about 3 minutes, documenting everything. Then I calmly held up my phone and told them everything they'd said was recorded and documented, and that I had the patient advocate's number ready to call if they didn't leave immediately. Reagan's face went red, but the financial advisor quickly gathered his papers. Without another word, they both walked out. I saved the recording with a timestamp and added it to my log.by 7:45 a.m. I was walking down to hospital administration with my notebook tucked under my arm. The same woman who dismissed me yesterday was behind her desk, and her expression changed the moment she saw me. I sat across from her and opened my notebook, showing her my documentation log with precise timestamps, witness names, and copies of nursing notes. I explained Reagan's pattern of harassment, her threats to pull the plug if granted guardianship, her interference in April's medical care, her attempts to manipulate me. The administrator looked uneasy, shifting papers on her desk and avoiding eye contact. She kept emphasizing Reagan's experience as a retired nurse and her history at the hospital. She even suggested I was emotionally overwhelmed and might not be thinking clearly. I stayed calm. I told her I was a licensed physical therapist, I understood patient care, and I was documenting everything for legal purposes. She cleared her throat and said she'd make a note of my concerns, but couldn't restrict family visitation without proper cause. So I asked what the proper procedure was to request a patient advocate and file a formal restriction on visitation hours. After a pause, she reluctantly pulled out a stack of forms and explained that I needed to submit everything in writing to the Patient Advocacy Office and Risk Management. I filled out the forms right there at her desk, citing April's elevated heart rate during Reagan's visits, her visible distress and tears, and the repeated pattern of harassment. I listed specific dates, times, and the names of nursing staff who had witnessed it all. When I handed the paperwork back, she stamped each page with the date and time and said she'd forward them to the appropriate offices, though she didn't sound enthusiastic about it. I asked for copies, and she made them for me. Back in April's room at 9:15 a.m., I set up my phone on a small tripod I'd borrowed from the nurse's station. I positioned it so it captured April's face and hands clearly, then started recording. I explained to April what I was doing and asked her to respond to my questions. Squeeze once for yes, I said softly. Twice for no. I asked April if she could hear me, and she gave one firm squeeze. I asked if she wanted Reagan to keep visiting, 2 quick squeezes for no. Then I asked if she still wanted to stay married to me, and she pressed once, hard enough to make my eyes water. When I asked her to spell something in our honeymoon code, she pressed out the numbers for stay, fight, and love. The day nurse came in while this was happening and stood quietly by the door, watching. When I finished recording, she walked over and added her observations to April's official chart without me even asking. For the first time, I felt like someone was on our side. At 11:30 a.m., the door opened. Reagan walked in with Louis right behind her. I stayed seated next to April's bed, my phone recording in my pocket. Louis barely looked at April before announcing he needed to perform a neurological assessment. He spent maybe 4 minutes total, touched her hand twice, glanced at her fingers, and that was it. I tried showing him my notes, the videos, the nurse's documentation, but he talked over me. He insisted April's movements were just reflexive spinal responses, not voluntary. I told him she was spelling words, responding correctly to yes/no questions, but he just shook his head. Reagan stood near the door with her arms crossed, watching with that same self-satisfied look. Then Louis pulled out his prescription pad and wrote that I was showing signs of denial-based psychosis and should be removed from medical decision-making for my wife. He handed the paper to Reagan like it was some kind of victory trophy. She reminded me I had less than 24 hours left on her ultimatum before walking out with him, talking about guardianship petitions and psychiatric holds. My hands were shaking as I called my lawyer. I told him about Louis's so-called psych evaluation. He told me to file a formal written request for a patient advocate and notify risk management about any attempts to remove me from April's care. He said to send both letters immediately with read receipts for proof. I opened my email right there beside April's bed and started typing. I wrote to hospital administration requesting an immediate patient advocate, citing the pattern of harassment and threats to my authority. I attached my documentation log, the recording from that morning, and copies of the nursing notes showing April's voluntary responses. I sent it with a read receipt and waited until the confirmation came through. Then I drafted a follow-up email to risk management detailing everything: Reagan's harassment from 36 hours after the crash, her threats to pull the plug, Louis's 5-minute examination that contradicted multiple nursing notes. I attached timestamps, witness names, and my full documentation log showing April's consistent voluntary responses, plus the video of her spelling messages in our code. I sent that with a read receipt too, saving copies in 3 different places. Finally, my hands stopped shaking. I sat back beside April, took her hand gently, and felt her thumb press once against my palm. I knew we were going to fight this together, no matter what Reagan tried next. Around 8 p.m., my lawyer called back. His tone was more serious this time. He said he was referring me to a disability rights attorney named Giles McCarthy, a specialist in patient autonomy and family coercion cases. I wrote down the number on the back of my notebook as he explained that Giles had won cases just like ours against families trying to override spousal rights. I called immediately. Giles answered on the second ring. I launched into everything, probably too fast, but he stopped me gently and asked me to start from the beginning. So I did, from the accident to Reagan's first visit, the divorce attorney, the financial advisor, the ultimatum. He asked careful questions about April's responses, and I described the thumb presses, the coded messages, the voluntary resistance during exercises. When he asked about proof of Reagan's threats, I admitted I didn't have a recording, she'd whispered it. But I did have notes, witnesses, and nursing reports documenting April's distress. I explained how Lewis barely examined April before writing his psych evaluation. Giles told me to keep documenting everything, sign nothing Reagan brought, and call him immediately if she tried to file guardianship papers. We talked nearly an hour, and by the end I felt something I hadn't felt in days: relief. Someone finally understood. I sat next to April, held her hand, and whispered that help was coming, that we had someone fighting with us now. Her thumb pressed once, yes, and I squeezed back, smiling through tears. I stayed awake through the night, watching her breathe, adjusting her pillows when the nurses came in. Around 2 a.m., half asleep, I felt her thumb move again. 1 press, pause, for quick presses, pause, 3. I love you. My eyes shot open. Then she did it again, clear, deliberate. Then new words, stay, love, fight. I started crying so hard I could barely see, but I grabbed my notebook and wrote everything down with exact timestamps from the wall clock. I hit the call button and the nurse came in. I asked her to watch, and April repeated the patterns, slower but unmistakable. The nurse wrote her own notes, recording the time and patterns, and said she'd add it to April's official chart as witnessed voluntary communication, significant progress. When she left, I just sat there holding April's hand, crying, telling her how proud I was and how strong she was. We weren't done fighting. Not even close. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept holding April's hand through the night, feeling her occasional reassuring thumb presses against my palm. When the morning nurse came in at 7 a.m., I showed her my overnight documentation, all the timestamps and coded patterns. She read it carefully, then pulled up April's chart and checked the night nurse's notes. When she asked if she could add her own observation, I said, please do. She typed for several minutes, then turned the screen toward me. Her note read, patient demonstrates consistent, voluntary, purposeful movement in response to spouse's verbal cues, distinct from reflexive responses. Pattern recognition and communication via established code system indicates preserved cognitive function and intentional motor control. I asked for a printed copy, and she handed it to me, still warm from the printer. I folded it carefully and placed it in my documentation folder. It felt like the first real proof of what I'd been saying all along. At exactly noon, Giles called. He'd been thinking about our case all night and now had a plan. 1. Send Reagan a cease and desist letter demanding she stop the harassment. 2. Request a formal visitor restriction due to documented patient distress. 3. Ask for an ethics committee review on coercion patterns. 4. Prepare for an emergency hearing if Reagan pursued guardianship. He asked if I was ready to retain him, and I said yes without hesitation. He emailed me the agreement immediately, and I signed it right on my phone. Within minutes, he confirmed we were officially attorney and client now. He promised to have the cease and desist ready by end of day. Around 3 p.m., a woman knocked and introduced herself as Valentina McCarthy, the patient advocate assigned to our case. She looked to be in her 50s, calm and kind, and instantly put me at ease. She spent the next hour going over everything: the accident, Reagan's visits, my documentation, and the nursing notes. She even watched the videos, then she asked to meet April directly. Standing beside the bed, she introduced herself and said she was there to help. She asked April to press once for yes if she understood. April's thumb moved clearly. Valentina continued with a few more questions, and April responded correctly each time. Valentina took detailed notes, then explained she'd worked on trauma-informed visitation policies before. Systems that protect patients from stress while respecting family roles. From now on, April's stress during visits would be monitored, and any visitor causing distress could be restricted. Relief hit me so hard I almost couldn't speak. Finally, someone with authority believed us. Before leaving, Valentina said she was recommending an ethics committee consultation to determine if Reagan's actions were coercive. The committee would review all the documentation, interview staff, and their findings would guide hospital policy, even hold up in court if needed. She squeezed my shoulder before leaving and said I was doing everything right. That evening, I organized everything like a proper legal dossier: logs, witness notes, printed copies, videos on a labeled thumb drive, and a timeline of Reagan's threats. I emailed it all to Giles. He called back an hour later, impressed. He said I'd built the kind of airtight case that could stand in court. The next morning, while doing range of motion exercises with April's arms, there was a knock at the door. A man in a suit stepped in, holding a manila envelope. "Are you April's husband?" he asked. When I said yes, the man handed me a manila envelope and said quietly, "You've been served." My hand shook as I opened it. Petition for emergency guardianship. Reagan's name was printed at the top as the petitioner. My stomach twisted as I skimmed the pages. Respondent is mentally unfit to make medical decisions. Patient is in a persistent vegetative state with no hope of recovery. Spouse is delusional and refusing to accept medical reality. She described April as brain dead and me as psychotic. The petition requested that all medical decision-making be transferred to Reagan, giving her authority over end-of-life decisions. I sank into the chair beside April's bed, still clutching the papers, my hands shaking so badly I could barely read.